Coober Pedy, regarded as the opal capital of the world. In fact, 80% of the world's opals have come from Coober Pedy in South Australia. But if it wasn't for the antics of a 14-year-old boy prospecting for quartz along a mountain range known as the Stuart Ranges, then this township of Coober Pedy may never have existed, or may never have prospered in the same way as we know it today. So in today's video, let me tell the story about how the opals were discovered and how this small township, consisting of only 1,500 people, was founded in 1915. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video discussing, as I previously mentioned, the story about how opals were discovered and how Coober Pedy was founded. To start this story, we have to cast our mind back to the year 1858, when the very famous explorer John McDowell Stuart went on his first of a series of 6 expeditions that he would make across South Australia and then through Central Australia to the northern coastline. But in this first expedition in mid-1858, the idea was to discover mineral deposits and lands that could be leased out for pastoralists. John McDowell Stuart would leave what is known as the Orotunga station near Lake Torrens in the May of 1858. And as he travelled westwards towards the sort of outback regions, he would come very, very close to what is now conceived to be the township of Coober Pedy. McDowell Stuart was accompanied by a man named Forster, as well as a local guide who knew the area, or this part of South Australia, quite well. But by the time they had reached the area close to Coober Pedy in the July of 1858, things were looking a little bit desperate and the expedition had to be abandoned. So the mineral deposits were never found, and neither, of course, were the opals. Skipping ahead now to the December of 1914, and whilst Europe was in the throes and the beginning stages of the First World War, a 4-man team was being constructed, consisting of Philip Winch, Jim Hutchison, his son William Hutchison, and Mel Mackenzie. They called themselves the New Colorado Prospecting Syndicate, and their plan for early 1815 was to go out to a place called Lake Phillipson, which is, ironically, just 80 kilometers southwest of modern-day Coober Pedy. Their initial goal was to locate the quartz that had been gently discovered there in the early 1890s, make their money, and return home rich men. They made the 400-kilometer trek westwards from their base in Maree with 6 camels and roughly 650 litres of water. And in the 14 weeks that they travelled and then searched round Lake Phillipson, the 4-man syndicate found very little, if anything at all, resembling quartz. Also happening in the winter of 1914-15 was Australia's worst drought, with temperatures in the South Australian region that the syndicate was travelling in reaching between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius. Water was becoming very short in supply, so the syndicate moved off to a place called the Carryingalama Creek. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. They travelled there and camped in this spot, hoping to retrieve some precious water resources and maybe just look for some quartz whilst they were there. Whilst camped at this spot, some 3 miles from the Stuart Ranges, There comes this extract from Jim Hutchinson's diary, who describes the day of the 1st of February 1915 and the discovery of opals. Winch, Mackenzie and I left camp on a riding camel, each in search of water. Bill was left in charge of the camp. We got back into camp just at dark, I being the last. No sooner had I put my camel down when Mackenzie said that young Bill had gone bush, left his water bag behind, but taken with him a pick and a shovel. The fire ashes were completely out, so we knew he had been away many hours. But the rest of the syndicate needn't have been worried for young Will Hutchinson's life, because young Bill returned back to camp with a small sugar bag's worth of precious rocks, declaring to his father, "Have a look at that, Dad. I think you'll find some good stuff there." The opals were found on the 1st of February 1915, and within 2.5 weeks, the syndicate's claim had been pegged out, and the leases which they were going to give were also being pegged out in the process. But on the 19th of February 1915, the syndicate had to leave their claim and their spot from what is now Coober Pedy because they were, desperately running out of water. The same problem that had brought them to this Coober Pedy area. But it was Jim and Patrick O'Neill, who were experienced opal miners from the Tarcoola gold mines some 150 miles south. They would go on to make the biggest first contributions to what is now Coober Pedy and the mining town that it is today. They would create the Big Flat, a 40-acre pitch that between its first 5 years of 1915 and 1919 produced some 50,000 pounds worth of opals out of the ground, some 20,000 just in that first year. And only 5 to 10 miners were actually working on the site. Jim and Patrick O'Neill were also the first to sink a well and bore system in the Coober Pedy area. But the water from this well system was rather undrinkable, so they also became the first to produce fresh rainwater tanks, collection tanks, so that when the skies did dim and rain did fall, they were able to drink the water that was produced. They were the first to use dynamite when mining for the opals, and they were also the first to open up a store within Coober Pedy that would help and service other miners. Now there's a few things that I can extract from the points and firsts that Patrick and Jim O'Neill did in the late 1910s. The first, of course, is the water supply, and I mentioned that the well and bore system was rather undrinkable, so rainwater tanks were being used instead. So in 1921, after 3 years of lobbying by government geologists, the South Australian government decided to install a giant water tank which had the capacity to hold 500,000 gallons of water. But it wouldn't be until 1985 that Coober Pedy was installed with a proper water network so that water is now freely available on tap. Prior to 1985, a weekly ration was given of 90 litres of water per person living in Coober Pedy. The installation of this water tank in 1921 coincided with a mass rush of individuals, some 200 in total, who would descend on Coober Pedy looking for opals. They were referred to as diggers because a numerous number of them had been former World War I trench diggers over up in Europe, and some of them were also railway construction workers. And this brings me on to my second extracted point, because these diggers were very well known for creating the dugout style of living, a feat which Jim and Patrick O'Neill implemented in their own way when they opened up their first store. These dugouts were actually done for a practical reason. In the very earliest days, many of the miners would actually sleep inside their mines because it was a lot cooler underground. And so these dugouts were basically the underground original mines of Coober Pedy. Dust storms can often occur during the months of September and October as well. So actually having these dugouts was practical for temperature and to avoid the major storms that happen in the swirling landscape of the outback Australia. The first post office was dug underground in 1920. And even the 4 major churches that are in and around the Coober Pedy area were also dug underground. The underground system and dugout way of life is a rather easy and practical means of living. You can simply dig your tunnel, and depending on how big or small you want your room, you just dig out accordingly. In 1920, Coober Pedy was named and founded as a settlement area by the original Progress Association, a group formed of about 100 miners in 1919, to carry out certain rules which are essential for the good health and welfare of the whole of the men here. On the 29th of May 1920, 36 of these association members voted on what to name this new township that they had created. The first initial instance was to call it Hutchinson, after Bill Hutchinson that had discovered the first opals way back in 1915. Other names were considered like Gemville and Opal Range. But it was decided that Coober Pedy was best for the naming of this township. It actually comes from an indigenous word meaning the white man's hole. With a name now attached to this proper township, streets now needed to be created and needed to be named. So the council committee that was subsequently created decided to name the streets after pioneers and recent, circa 1920s, pioneers who had contributed to the development of Coober Pedy and the mining industry. But there is an issue that still is prolific to this very day, as it did 100 years ago. Coober Pedy is an incredibly isolated township. The nearest train station in the early 20th century was a place called Kingunya, some 32 hours away. The nearest proper township close to Coober Pedy was 100 miles away, even further than that. So a lot of the dugout systems and a lot of the miners in Coober Pedy were made out of the need to be self-sufficient with limited resources, limited water and limited food on offer. By the 1920s and 30s, motorised trucks were making the trek from South Australia, Adelaide and various other major settlements up to Coober Pedy. But a lot of these resources were still, right up until the 1960s, coming by donkey, coming by camel even. Even with the installation of the Stuart Highway during the Second World War that runs alongside the Coober Pedy settlement, things were still very slow to sort of progress to how we recognise Coober Pedy today. Now in today's world, people can stay at Coober Pedy, maybe buy some gemstones, look around the museums and look at the old way of life that people used to live 100 years ago. You might be able to stay in one of the hotels around town, some of which are done in the dugout style. And public transport, including the Greyhound bus, passes to and from on a semi-regular basis from Coober Pedy. And should anything go drastically wrong and you may find yourself ill or injured, thankfully a medical centre was built in 1964 and a proper hospital built in 1982, limiting the great distances that people required to go to in order to get medical attention. And thankfully, with the Royal Flying Doctors, the sort of air hospital service that was created in the 1920s and 30s, they too also service Coober Pedy greatly. And they're a big asset to the health and well-being of Australian citizens, especially those out in the outback. And with that, I can conclude today's video. Thank you for joining me today as I have delved just a little bit into the story of Coober Pedy, the characters that have surrounded it, and indeed the dugouts that make this little township of 1,500 people so unique. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I shall see you in the next video. See you later.